The first frost of the 10th year does not sparkle. It does not catch the light or diamond the edges of the world as it once did in the stories of the old men. Instead, it clings like gray ash to the jagged eaves of a city that has long since forgotten the color of a summer sky. To walk these streets is to wade through a sea of permanent charcoal, where the very air feels heavy, tasting of damp earth, cooling tallow, and the sharp metallic tang of old iron. There is no dawn to wake the sleeping, only the rhythmic hollow tolling of a cracked bronze bell, a sound that does not celebrate the day, but merely confirms that the heart of the city has not yet stopped beating. They gather in the cathedral, a forest of shivering silhouettes seeking a warmth that the stones no longer provide. The incense here has lost its sweetness. It now smells of desperation and the cloying scent of wet wool. In the flickering amber of a dying rushlight, a young girl kneels, not in prayer, but in discovery. Her small, pale fingers trace the intricate carvings of a stone hearth that has been cold since the hour of her birth. She moves her hand slowly over the limestone, memorizing the fanned tails and sharp beaks of birds she has never seen in flight, creatures of a mythic, sun-drenched world that feel as distant as the stars. To her, the sun is not a celestial body, but a ghost story told by parents who weep when they think she isn't listening. In this perpetual twilight, silence is more than the absence of sound. It is a heavy shroud, a physical weight that presses against the eardrums. The only defiance against this encroaching void is the frantic, rhythmic scratching of a quill in the scriptorium. There a monk hunches over parchment, his knuckles swollen from the damp, recording the slow fading of a civilization's memory before the ink freezes in the well. He writes because to stop is to admit that the darkness has won. But as the last candle stubs flicker and drown in their own wax, a new fear begins to stir in the marrow of the people. A realization that the shadows are no longer just outside the walls, but are beginning to take root within the very souls of those left behind. A single candle flame, desperate and thin, flickers against the weeping stone walls of the great hall. It casts long, distorted shadows that dance across the tapestries like the ghosts of the lords and poets who once feasted here under a sky of true blue. In this tomb of a palace, there is no herald of dawn, no golden spear of light to pierce the clerestory windows. There is only the weary, rhythmic changing of the guard, the sound of their salt-stained leather boots crunching over cobblestones slicked with 10 years of fallen soot. They move not as soldiers of a proud realm, but as mourners pacing the perimeter of a massive, unburied corpse. The king sits upon a throne of tarnished silver, his crown a heavy burden of iron and dull gems that no longer catch a glint of the sun. His eyes are clouded with the same milky gray cataracts that have claimed the horizon, as if the world's blindness has seeped into his very marrow. In his trembling hand he clenches a cluster of withered rye. The grain is brittle, hollow, and black at the root. It is a symbolic remnant of a kingdom that once overflowed with golden light, a harvest that now feels like a cruel fairy tale told to children who have never known the warmth of a noonday heat. He kneels not to God, but to the memory of the soil, feeling the life sap away from the land he was sworn to protect. Here, in the heart of the sunless decade, the law is no longer written in the light of reason, but in the desperation of the dark. Justice is enforced by men whose hearts have become as cold and unyielding as the permafrost gripping the city's deep foundations. Fear has replaced the tithe, and silence has replaced the song. Every decree issued from this shadowed throne carries the weight of a death sentence, for in a land where nothing grows, every extra mouth is a threat to the collective survival. Yet, as the king drops the ruined grain onto the cold floor, the sound of it hitting the stone is muffled by something new, a thick, rising mist from the docks that carries the scent of something rotting, something ancient, and something that has finally decided to crawl out of the black water.
Down where the city meets the dead water, the creeping mist parts to reveal a river turned to a ribbon of black glass. There is no reflection here, only an abyssal depth that swallows the dim ambient gray. The heavy, suffocating scent of brine and rotting timber rises from the decaying docks, clinging to the damped wool of those who still dare to walk the water's edge. The great merchant cogs, once heavy with Eastern silk and foreign spice, now rot at their moorings. Their frayed ropes groan against the sluggish tide like condemned men testing their iron chains. The water does not flow, it simply waits. Away from the suffocating damp of the river, deep within the narrow, lightless alleys, survival has become an act of blind memory. A solitary weaver sits before her heavy timber loom in the absolute dark. Her eyes, long ago surrendered to the endless gloom, stare blankly ahead, yet her calloused hands move with a desperate, unbroken rhythm. She passes a worn wooden shuttle through the warp and weft by touch alone, spinning rough, undyed threads into tapestries of a world she can no longer see. She weaves the phantom textures of green valleys and golden harvests into the heavy fabric, a silent, tactile rebellion against a sky that remains a bruised, stagnant purple. Above the sagging rooftops, a permanent ceiling of thick volcanic ash stifles the stars and smothers the very concept of morning. To live in this cursed decade is to exist in the terrifying pause between heartbeats. It is a world reduced to paranoid whispers and heavy shadows, where the rare, sharp clink of a copper coin dropping onto a wooden table no longer signals wealth, but sounds instead like a hollow funeral knell. There is nothing left to buy. No cargo arrives on the blackened tide. Hunger is an intimate phantom that sits beside every family at every unlit hearth. Every iron-studded door barred shut against the creeping frost stands as a silent, desperate prayer to a sun that has abandoned its station. Yet as the physical world succumbs to the rot, a different kind of desperation takes hold. High above the silent looms and dead ships, where the cold bites deepest into the stone, a solitary flickering light reveals a frantic attempt to preserve what little remains of human memory before the absolute dark descends. Beneath the vaulted, frost-cracked arches of the scriptorium, the only sound is the frantic, dry scratching of a quill. To the weary monks, it sounds like the desperate wings of a moth trapped against a cold window pane, fluttering in a darkness that will never lift. A lone scholar, his fingers blue and stiff from the relentless chill, dips his metal nib into a well of ink brewed from crushed charcoal and bitter oak gall. He is not recording the lives of saints or the lineage of kings today. Instead, his hand trembles as he enters a more visceral history. The exact hour and minute the last plow horse was led to the butcher's block to stave off the starvation of 1,000 souls. The taste of the city has become a poison that no one can wash away. It is the flavor of stale, watered ale and the constant gritty texture of falling volcanic soot that coats every tongue, every loaf of meager bread, and every whispered prayer. Outside, in the narrow arteries of the town, women wrap themselves in heavy, coarse wool dyed the deep, bruised color of dried blood. They huddle in the lee of stone walls, seeking a shared warmth that never truly penetrates the bone, their breaths blooming in the air like small, fading ghosts.
This is the reality of a decade of exile spent within one's own city walls, a slow, agonizing siege conducted by a sky that has turned its back on the world. In the abandoned marketplace, where once the air sang with the cries of spice merchants and the scent of fresh lavender, there is now only a suffocating, damp silence. The stalls have been broken down for firewood, leaving behind a skeletal landscape of rotting timber and mud. The only light to be found here is not from a torch or a lantern, but the sickly, pale, phosphorescent glow of fungi blooming in the lightless corners of the square. It is a cold, ethereal green that feeds on the decay, signaling a slow and quiet descent into the very earth they once farmed. But as the people look to the ground for sustenance, a different kind of rot begins to take hold in the one place even the darkness should not reach, the sacred halls where the spirit is meant to be healed. Rain falls like leaden weights, a cold and rhythmic drumming that washes the soot from the stone gargoyles, but never truly cleanses the spirit of the street. Each drop carries the chill of a sky that has forgotten how to be kind, pooling in the deep ruts of the mud where the wheels of commerce have long since ceased to turn. In the velvet shadows of the apothecary's shop, the air is thick with the scent of a dying world. Dried herbs, rosemary for a remembrance no one wants, and rue for a regret no one can escape, hang from the rafters like shriveled, brittle charms. They are the remnants of a medicine that no longer works, dangling against a plague of darkness that defies every tincture and every prayer. Deep in the belly of the city, a lone soldier sits by the dim orange glow of a peat fire, his shadow stretching like a giant against the damp timber. He draws a whetstone across a rusted blade, the rhythmic metallic scrape echoing through the narrow winding alleys. It is a lonely sound, cutting through the silence where children no longer run or laugh. Instead, they play haunting games of silence and hiding, moving through the ruins like small pale wraiths who have learned that to be seen is to be at risk. There is no joy in their discovery, only a quiet, shivering mastery of the dark. Within these shuttered homes, a sacred desperation has taken hold. Families gather around the hearth, not for a feast, but for a ritual of survival. They hoard the very last jars of honey, tilting the glass to watch the slow, viscous movement of a golden liquid that tastes of a sun-drenched past, a sweetness from a world of bees and wildflowers that feels like a beautiful, cruel hallucination. To swallow it is to remember what it was to be warm. To finish it is to admit the winter has won. The city has become a vessel of collective grief, a great ship of stone drifting aimlessly through a sea of endless, suffocating midnight. But as the honey jars run dry and the fires burn low, the people turn their eyes toward the only structure that still promises a horizon. They look to the great cathedral, where the bells are beginning to toll a different kind of rhythm, not for the living and not for the dead, but for the very soul of the faith that is beginning to fracture under the weight of the gloom. The great cathedral stands as a skeletal sentinel of limestone, its soaring arches reaching toward a heaven that has fallen silent. Without the sun to breathe life into the artisan's work, the magnificent stained glass has turned to obsidian, dull, opaque, and cold. The vibrant reds of martyrs and the celestial blues of the Virgin have been swallowed by the void, leaving only a shimmering black void where there was once a promise of paradise. Inside, the bishop's voice is a dry, desperate rasp, a hollow sound echoing against the damp stone as he recites litanies to a god who seems to have turned his face away for an eternity of winters. He stands at the altar, his hands trembling as he handles a reliquary of ancient bone and beaten gold. The metal is biting and indifferent against his skin, a physical weight that offers no spiritual warmth. He clutches the relic not as a source of power, but as a drowning man clutches a stone, representing a faith that must now find a way to survive without the witness of the sky. The incense smoke no longer rises. It hangs low in the freezing nave, a thick fog of myrrh and unwashed wool that clings to the desperate faces of the congregation. They do not look up for miracles anymore. They look down at the floor, their knees bruised by years of unheeded petition. Outside the heavy oak doors, the wind howls through the narrow arrow slits of the city walls, carrying the acrid, terrifying scent of distant, burning forests, fires lit by those who have finally abandoned the city for the wild. Within the walls, every extinguished torch is felt as a small, intimate death, a shedding of another layer of humanity. The inhabitants are left to navigate the deepening labyrinth of their lives, not by sight, but by the fraying threads of memory. They move through their homes by touch, counting steps and feeling for the familiar gouges in the wood, terrified that one day even the mental image of their own front doors will dissolve into the dark. As the bishop's final prayer dissipates into the freezing air, the silence that follows is not peaceful, it is expectant. The people have reached the end of their endurance, and the sacred rituals that once held the city together are beginning to fray like old rope. A single spark, struck not from a candle, but from the heavy hammer of a forge, begins to signal that if the light will not return from the heavens, it must be forged in the fires of the earth. In the cavernous gloom of a city that has forgotten the dawn, the first sound of the final watch is the rhythmic, violent scream of iron against iron. A blacksmith strikes his anvil, each blow a desperate heartbeat in the dark. The sparks fly like dying stars, swirling briefly in the soot-choked air before they are swallowed by the void. This heat is a fleeting, stolen mercy, a localized sun that lives and breathes only through the agony of the bellows. The moment that labored breathing stops, the cold returns, more predatory than before, creeping over the leather aprons and the blackened hearths like a physical tide. Here, fire is no longer a tool, it is a fading memory of the light they once possessed. High above the huddled streets, on the ramparts where the wind carries the scent of frozen iron, a sentry stares into the absolute nothingness beyond the walls. His heavy wool cloak is stiff, crusted with the rime of a decade-long frost that never thaws. He watches for a horizon that has long since vanished behind a veil of eternal churning cloud, a sky that has become a tombstone for the world. He does not watch for an invading army or the glint of enemy spears. He watches for a ghost. He watches for a single streak of gold that might prove he hasn't already died and descended into the harrowing. The bells of the city no longer ring for the joy of weddings or the promise of new births. Those sounds have been buried under 10 years of ash. Now the bronze only tolls to mark the passage of the shadow, a heavy funereal rhythm that counts the hours of a day that never truly arrived. It has become a kingdom of the blind leading the weary, a place where the map of the world has been replaced by the reach of a hand. In the drafty halls and the damp cellars, the simple, trembling act of lighting a final wick becomes more than a necessity. It is a defiant, sacred ritual against the encroaching, absolute silence of the end. Yet as the last of the tallow melts away, a strange stillness settles over the cursed stones. They have survived a decade in the grave, and as the final bell rings out over the lightless spires, the question is no longer when the sun will return, but what kind of creatures they have become in its absence. The city remains, a dark monument to endurance, waiting for a morning that may no longer recognize the people it left behind in the dark.